Hello and welcome to FINA H101 Art Appreciation. This is being presented by Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne. I'm Dr. Aaron Schwartz and this is week 11. Our topic for this week will be art and the divine and art and its relationship to belief. Now throughout the semester, we've already seen lots of images derived from religion and images that are intended to inspire religious devotion or be used in the act of religious worship. We're going to take some time this week to focus specifically on art and belief in the divine and representing the divine versus actually seeing or feeling the divine. We'll be looking at examples of religious art from Islamic cultures, ancient Greek and Egyptian cultures, as well as Christian cultures. Now clearly this does not represent the full range of religious traditions. So I just do want to acknowledge that right now, that we cannot possibly look at every single religious tradition. We'll be looking at some of the more major ones that are discussed in your book and within these sorts of contexts. But certainly in the discussion board and so on can be a nice space for us to address other religious traditions that are not included here. So first let's consider this quote, which is the second commandment from the Old Testament book of Exodus. So take a moment and read this quote from the Bible. And we're going to try to deal with this in terms of what it represents to some of the major religious traditions we're going to look at. So hopefully you've had a chance to read this over. The second commandment is the basis for what we call iconoclasm, which is the rejection of images, usually for religious purposes. And iconism is the belief or practice of iconoclasm. And an iconic image or religion would not use images. The opposite of this is idolatry, or the worshipping of graven images. Now I want you to consider what we've already looked at during this semester. How does the second commandment from the Bible fit with Christian art? We've seen so many images of the saints, stories from the Bible, images, even portraits, you might say, of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. But doesn't the second commandment forbid images? Are there any other religions that follow the practice of iconoclasm, or maybe follow it more strictly? So in your notes, I really want you to consider this. This is not merely an academic point. The issue of the second commandment, which seems to very clearly say that graven images are forbidden. How do we reconcile this with Christianity's tradition of portraying likenesses of divine figures, not just Jesus and Mary, but God himself in many cases? This is going to be a point of contention for many religious denominations of Christianity. And I tend to sort of speak about religions with a very broad brush, as it were, to say Christians think this and Muslims think that and so on. That's not exactly accurate because there's always a lot of variety within particular denominations. But in your notes, please take a moment to think about this. What is the second commandment actually saying? What does it actually forbid? And in your opinion, does this long tradition of Christian art, is it obeying the second commandment, or is it interpreting the second commandment in a particular way? Try to articulate your own thoughts and ideas on this in your notes. So the Ten Commandments are the basis of law for three major monotheistic religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. When these religions were developing, they were coexisting with pagan religions of the ancient Romans, Greeks, Mesopotamians, and Egyptians. These were polytheistic religions. Polytheistic means having many gods, in which people prayed to statues of gods and goddesses. These religions practice what we call idolatry, where objects are directly worshipped. In reaction to these religions, to differentiate themselves from these religions, and following the second commandment, images were treated differently in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In all of these religions, images were banned to varying degrees at varying times. Now this slide shows the interior of a mosque. That's an Islamic structure for worship. This is the famous mosque at Cordoba in Spain. Parts of Spain used to be ruled by an Islamic caliphate. While there are no images of figures, this space is filled with visual elements to enhance its feeling of sacredness. You see an emphasis on ornament and design. Ornament is defined as embellishment or adornment of a surface intended to enhance its attractiveness, and design can be defined as the arrangement of elements, sometimes the pattern repetition of elements with the intent of enhancing the attractiveness of a site and affecting the experience of the observer. Now, I'd like you in your notes to take a moment to consider I'd like you to point out what aspects of this interior would be described as ornament and which are design. How do they work together? In addition, I'd like you to think about the experience of the visitor. Do you recognize this as a sacred space? And what may indicate to you that this is in fact a sacred space? Do you feel like images are missing, or that the design and ornament fulfilling, satisfying? Without images in a space like this, do you think a person could focus more on the divine? As you can see, almost every inch of the interior surface here is covered with ornament. How would this kind of overwhelming visual experience contribute to the feelings of a worshiper or a religious visitor? Here's a closer-up view of a niche in a wall from that same mosque. A worshiper would face this niche when praying to direct his or her prayers to Mecca, the Muslim holy city in Saudi Arabia. In addition to ornament and design, the niche is embellished with calligraphy and an elaborate and decorative writing style. We saw a plate with fake calligraphy or pseudo-calligraphy in an earlier lesson, but in this case, it's real writing in Arabic. These prayers are from the Quran, the Muslim holy book. It's sacred writing. Now, do you recognize this as writing, or do you see it as a decorative pattern? Do you think calligraphy can be a form of ornament? Remember that ornament is defined as embellishment or adornment of a surface intended to enhance its attractiveness. And really consider the effect on this. Even if you don't read Arabic, that's fine. If you're not a reader of this language, what is the effect of it on you anyway? So here the calligraphy is used in place of figural imagery to remind the worshiper of holy wisdom. Now, in your opinion, do you think this can encourage the religious experience of the worshiper if he or she could read it? What about if the worshiper couldn't read it, but simply knew that these were sacred words? So some of you looking at this may be literate in Arabic and may be able to make out some of these words. Some of you looking at this will not be able to read Arabic. And I think that's going to be interesting to consider in terms of how we imagine a worshiper using this kind of space. If you do not read Arabic and you cannot read this text, what about it perhaps indicates to you that it is in fact holy or sacred words? What about the design, the layout, your relationship to it might indicate that to you? So it's not only holy books and religious laws that discuss the role of images in religion. Philosophy also deals with this issue. These quotes here are by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and are from about the year 300 BCE. Please take a moment to read these short little quotes. and then summarize how you think Aristotle felt about images. So in your notes, again, just summarize what you think Aristotle is saying here, and what did he think the responsibility of an artist was. Okay, this slide and the next one have lots of text on them, but please don't be discouraged and please don't skip them. They are more quotes from another philosopher from about 200 AD. These recount a conversation about the role of images in religion, and it's actually kind of a funny debate once you read it. So please take a moment to read it. Please don't skip it. And at the end of the next slide, we'll try taking a stab at trying to decipher what these philosophers are saying. Here's more of that conversation. Again, please don't skip it. When you're done reading it, try to summarize what the argument is here and what's actually being said, what's being argued in this conversation. Okay, now we get to apply the philosophical quotes we just read. On the left, you see an Egyptian sculpture of the god Horus in the form of a bird. Depicted standing between his legs is a pharaoh. The god is much greater in size and seems to be protecting the human form of the king. The god, however, is wearing a headdress of the type the ruler would have worn. On the right is a Greek sculpture of a god, showing in the ideal nude human form. Now, first of all, let's consider the debate you just read about the representation of gods by the Greeks and by the Egyptians. How would these two sculptures be judged in relationship to what you just read? Secondly, I'd like you to think back to, or go back in this presentation to, that earlier quote by Aristotle. What do you think Aristotle would have thought about this sculpture of a god in the form of a man? And really take the time to think about how this relates to what you just read. Furthermore, consider, how are these two pieces different? How do these differences in style perhaps represent a difference in the relationship between the divine and the worshiper. So really think about this. When we have a God that is represented as an animal form, and a God represented in a human form, that suggests something perhaps about a fundamental difference between the worshiper and God, and how they're supposed to relate to the idea of the divine. Consider that for a moment, and jot down these ideas in your own words. Here we're taking a look at two different paintings representing the Christian tale of Veronica. Veronica, though it's not an uncommon woman's name, literally means true image. Vera in Latin means true, and icon means image. Now, according to the story, the follower of Jesus went along with him to the site of his crucifixion. As he struggled to carry his cross, Veronica offered him her veil to wipe away his sweaty brow. And afterward, an image of Jesus' face was imprinted on the veil. Now, this story is not recorded in the Bible. It's more of a Christian folktale. The first known instance in which it was written down dates to about the year 1000, but not all Christians include it in their belief practices. In the painting on the left, you see her offering her veil to him, and on the right, you see her displaying her veil after an image of his face has been miraculously transferred upon it. From about the 13, 14, up to about 1500, the actual cloth with an imprint of Christ's face, which was considered to be a miraculous relic, was displayed in Rome. There are accounts of people visiting it, touching it, and being healed by what they considered a direct contact with the divine. The cloth then went missing or was stolen around the year 1500, and since then there have been various theories about its whereabouts and its authenticity. Quite recently, the original cloth was officially rediscovered in an Italian monastery where it had been apparently hidden since 1660. In 2006, the Pope visited it and officially acknowledged it as a holy Catholic relic. Now, I'd like you to consider this tale and this miraculous cloth and how it might have affected Christian opinion of whether it was okay to represent images of Jesus, having been given a divine, you might say official, copy of Jesus' face. How might this story be used as a justification for representing the divine when the second commandment seems to forbid it? So consider this, because this is a very important part of Christian theology. Even though this tale is not written in the Bible, Christian scholars will use this example to explain why it's okay for Christians to venerate and display images of Jesus Christ. Theophany is the appearance of the divine to a mortal, or the appearance of God to a man, often in a vision. In the story of St. Luke, which is depicted in this painting from 1513, Luke had a vision which he saw the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus surrounded by angels. He recorded the vision in a painting. The artwork we are looking at here shows Luke painting his painting of the Holy Vision. Now, do you think that recording a vision, making a record of a theophany, is something that the second commandment might forbid? Or might one consider a theophany permission from the divine to share this image with mortals? Does the fact that Luke paints a vision and not the quote-unquote real Mary and Jesus make it more acceptable or less acceptable according to the second commandment? Finally, I'd like you to consider how the artist shows the vision versus the real world. And how can you tell Luke is not looking at a model or a statue or a real person? If you did not know the showed theophany, would you understand what was going on here? So again, take a moment to consider this in the context of Christianity and in the context of that second commandment. And again, this isn't merely an academic debate. This is a part of Christian theology and why Christian churches believe that it is okay to represent images of the divine, even though the second commandment seems to say that that shouldn't be okay. So write down your thoughts on what's going on in here. I will just point out a couple details within the image itself. Here you see St. Luke kneeling before his drawing board. He is looking at the vision that he sees before him and copying that on the paper. You notice that over Luke's shoulder is an angel who's also guiding him and helping describe the scene. You can see that the angel's hand is actually on Luke's hand, so you see this direct guidance of the angel. I'll also point out on the floor beside St. Luke are his sandals, so he's barefoot, and that's extremely significant. Throughout early Christianity, all the way through the Renaissance, churches in any sort of sacred space, you took your shoes off before you went to pray. You took your shoes off when you went in sacred areas of a church as a show of respect for this being a sacred space. So that's clearly indicated here by Luke not having his sandals on. So again, consider these questions and what might be communicated in terms of Christianity's fascination with images with what we see here. Now let's consider this piece. There's a lot going on here that is unrealistic and very beautiful. And once you start to look at how all of these elements interact, you'll see a lot of different things happening here. So first let's deal with the word fantasia. Fantasia is the representation of unreal qualities. Fantasia sounds a lot like fantasy, and that's actually what it is. In this painting by Raphael, which is painted for an altarpiece in a monastery, we see a great example of fantasia. In the center you see the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. To the right is Saint Barbara, and to the left is Saint Sixtus. Sixtus was a pope, and you can recognize this by his crown. Wait a minute. Which you can see here on the bottom left corner. It's not on his head. It looks like a cone. He's taken it off and placed it on the floor. Although his crown is on solid ground, look closely at what the figures are standing on. Clouds. Or are they even standing? Are they floating? Are they flying? Now, if you look really closely at the clouds, you can see little faces on the clouds. Especially, I think they're most clear over on the left-hand side, behind Sixtus and behind the Virgin Mary and Jesus. There are little faces back there. They're especially clear behind Sixtus's head. These are angels, or cherubs, little baby angels. There are two other angels at the bottom of the image, which are very clearly depicted and very famous. You may recognize them. They are rarely shown in context, but they show up on posters, coffee mugs, t-shirts. They've become really a part of popular culture. Let's look at the whole space now, this spatial fantasia. Starting with the angels. They are resting their hands on a ledge and looking up at the scene above them. Where are their feet at? But maybe the ledge is a stage. At the top you see curtains strung across on a curtain rod, and they are open just as they would be if you had the opportunity to peek at this theatrical scene before they fall shut. So I'd like you, in your notes, to consider how these aspects of fantasia might make it more acceptable, in terms of the second commandment, to represent the divine. And what do you think is actually being depicted here? What is real and what is fantasy? Do you think it is supposed to imitate a theophany? Finally, how do you think that the monks might have responded to this kind of image in the year 1512 when it was created? So also consider how many of you actually recognize those angels at the bottom, and did you know the context of them? But anyway, sort of organize your thoughts, organize your notes on this particular piece and how it might have been used within this context. In the mid-1600s, the Catholic Church stated that there should be greater emotion in religious artworks in order to inspire deeper emotions in worshippers. In response, Bernini created this sculpture entitled The Ecstasy of St Theresa. Ecstasy is defined as a rapturous experience that might mix pleasure and pain. Spiritual ecstasy, such that it was experienced by St. Theresa, results in the divine actually interacting with the body of a mortal. Theresa was a nun who lived about 100 years prior to the creation of this sculpture. She wrote an autobiography in which she recorded an instance when an angel came to visit her, and he had a long spear which he used to stab her repeatedly. She was in terrible pain and fell back moaning, as you can see in the sculpture, but at the same time she found surprising sweetness in the experience that she didn't want to end. This is described by her as ecstasy, and the manner in which the divine entered her body and she saw the glory of God. So I'd like you to consider how an image like this, showing an intense personal experience, might have inspired other worshippers. Can you see her ecstasy? Also, do you consider this image to show Theophany? Is it an example of Fantasia? If Theophany is real, if one believed an angel actually stabbed Theresa with a spear, can this still be Fantasia? So there's a lot going on here. It's a complex set of questions that I'm asking you. And do try to sort this out, and in your own words and in your own opinion, write down some ideas over these concepts that we've laid out here. For our final slide, we see two paintings which were created within about 25 years of each other in 1478 and in 1500. One of them depicts Jesus. The other is a self-portrait of an artist. Which do you think is which, and why? What characteristics, which were generally associated with images of Jesus Christ, are similar in both of these paintings? And I'm going to pause here for a few seconds so you can decide which one you think is a divine image and which one you think is a portrait. So, the image on the left is by Hans Memling. It was done in 1478 and is the image of Jesus. It's called Christ Blessing. You see his hand is raised with two fingers up. There are many artworks in which Christ is shown making this gesture, which we recognize as a gesture of blessing. These are described as belonging to the blessing type of image. What we are talking about when we describe this as a certain type of Christ image is typology. Typology is a study or analysis based on types or categories. It's done by organizing similar images with similar meaning into recognizable types. The painting by Dürer, done in 1500, however, is a self-portrait, and it is definitely imitating the blessing type of Christ. He painted this right around his 29th birthday when he was a young, successful artist, and he's known to have been pretty arrogant. Besides associating himself with Christ, what else in the portrait suggests that he is successful or important, or at least that he thinks he's important? What clues are maybe you picking up on here? Do you think this might have been offensive to some Christians? And finally, according to the strictest interpretation of the second commandment, which of these images might have been more problematic? So consider that, because clearly Dürer here is making a connection between common images of Christ and himself there, and that is not unproblematic, to be sure. Why might he want to do that? So organize your thoughts in your notes. Hopefully all of this thought and discussion and texts that we've dealt with this week will help you out in your quiz and your writing assignments and your online discussion. If you need some clarification on anything, or you're not too clear about some of the issues we talked about this week, definitely send me an email. You can find my email address on the Blackboard website. I'm happy to discuss these sorts of issues. If you have any issues with the Blackboard site, definitely send me an email so that we can get those taken care of. So that's all for this week. Thank you guys very much for your attention. I appreciate it. And until next time, I'll talk at you later.